it's Amy Williams here along with Charlie Unwin for the You Perform channel. Thank you very much for joining us again today. So last week we spoke together about that inside and outside performance. Today we're going to talk about making your best more predictable. What do you mean by using the word predictable, Charlie?
Yeah, I realise that when we look at the outside world, very little is predictable in sport. We don't always know what our opponent's going to do or what the track conditions are going to be like, what the weather's going to do. So really, predictability can only come from the inside. And why is it so important? Because I think when things are predictable, we can have a degree of confidence. So last week, we spoke about, where does predictability come from? Ultimately, it comes from this notion of the performance inside, i.e., we can do the same things, we can think the same things, and we can train our physiology and emotions to give us more predictability, to respond to certain situations in a predictable way. If we're responding to them in a different way every time, whatever we're trying to do on the outside, whatever the sport is, whatever the skill is or technique, it's going to be unpredictable. So that's where we're going with this. Now this is backed up by a lot of research, which it's quite difficult to research this stuff, but it continually sort of shows that 50 to 90% of our variance as certainly elite performers is down to mental skills, because by the time you've learned how to do something, it is now about whether you can do it when it matters. If you can't do it when it matters, you're going to be up there one day, down the next. So that's the principle.
Okay, well, I'm interested to then hear how we can all go about that, I guess, daily life, not daily life, sporting life. We all kind of know that if you've got 10 athletes that are physically the same, the one who's got that mental edge is going to be the one that comes home with the medals, with the goods.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. So, I mean, let's define a goal here, because we're going to be doing this with you, Amy.
Okay.
And I have teed you up for it, but largely you don't know what I'm going to do, which will make it far more interesting. So, what are we trying to do here? If I could say to you, or perhaps you with your athlete's hat on, not so many years ago, if I could say to you, look, think about you on a really good day. So you at your best. And don't just think about it, almost imagine yourself, like get into the picture. You might imagine yourself at the top of a mountain. You might see or even feel the snow coming down. You might notice what goes on around you, but really immerse yourself in that imagery. And if you can think of a time or even a competition where you were at your very best, a time where everything went to plan, where you almost couldn't put a foot wrong, you were in that flow, in that zone. So it's really good to practice immersing ourselves in that environment. Now, whatever you did that day, you're capable of achieving that physically because you've done it.
True. So,
the question here is, if you could simply recreate that day every single time, how good would you be? Now, mostly when I ask this question, people think, I'd probably be the best in the world, and you can actually prove that. But I think most people would agree, right, that if they could simply recreate them at their best, they would perform pretty well. They'd be at that next level.
Yeah, that's very, very true.
Yeah?
Okay, I'm going to take myself back there. I nearly was when you were explaining it all.
You will, don't worry, I'm going to get you there. I'm going to get you there more. So that's the goal here, is we're trying to simply perform. And consistency isn't always the most sort of sexy idea, because I think people want to kind of learn new things and get better at what they do by doing things differently. But there comes a point where actually we need to do what we already know how to do, but just do it really well and really consistently. And that's where I think keeping things simple can be really valuable as a concept, and that will be the subject of another week. Cool. So are you up for a bit of an exercise?
I am up for it. Let's see. I'm intrigued because as a sports psychologist, I never worked with you, and I know that you've worked with Lizzie Arnold and the other skeleton athletes that came through in my sport. So I'm intrigued to know where and what you're going to do with me. So let's try it out.
So one of the first books I ever read on psychology, it was called An Introduction to Psychology. And on the very first page, it had this triangle, which I'm going to share with you now. So this triangle stayed with me ever since. It's so simple and yet so important and effective by way of working with athletes. So in each corner of the triangle, we had 3 things. The first one was doing. The second one was thinking. Amy, what do you think the third one was?
Doing, thinking. And acting. Oh no, that would be your doing. Oh crikey, now you're putting me on the spot.
Feeling. It's all right. It's the one that most people don't have. So we'll learn more about that in a second. So yeah, feeling. The only point I'm trying to make here is that this performance inside that we keep talking about, how do we break it down? How do we make it a controllable entity? Well, the answer is by breaking it down into these 3 areas. Why? Because if we focus at any given point in time on what you're doing, we can always control what you're doing. If we focus on what you're thinking, i.e. what's going on in the head, we can control that. Okay, let's think about this. Let's focus on that. And if we're looking at feeling, we can also manage that. Arguably more difficult to manage. However, we can change the way that we feel, whether that's emotionally or kinesthetically, what's going on in our body. So we're going to break down your performance into these 3 areas. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at you at your bests and you at your worst. And what I would encourage you all to do is do this at home, because you kind of got to do this for yourself. And it helps actually writing it down with a pen and paper. So we're going to take Amy through this and you can follow on. You can follow on at home. Okay, so Amy, I want you to go back to that place when you were at your bests. Normally people love thinking of that time, but really immerse yourself in that place. And as you do, I want you to think about what you were doing. So if I was there watching you, what would I notice? What would I notice about your body language? What would I notice about the specific routine that you were adopting? What would I notice about your technique? So can you think of just an example, 1 or 2 things?
Okay. Well, I will probably obviously take you back to the Olympic Games, Vancouver. So what was I doing? I actually had taken myself up to a different level of the changing room where there were no other athletes. They were all down in another level. Because for me, which will flip on to my worst bit, I had to be happy and not concentrate about the other girls. So I was on my own with the physio, where all the physio beds were, with actually other athletes of other nations popping in and out, getting their legs warmed up. But I created my own little happiness bubble.
Great.
So I was actually very calm. My body language would just have been, there's a girl looking pretty chilled out and calm. Perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to put create space on there, if I'm allowed to use that language.
Okay.
And in fact, I think you've highlighted how you were feeling there as well. So calm. And would you describe that calmness in any other way in terms of how you feel, whether emotionally or in your body?
I mean, you're not going to kid yourself. I was a nervous wreck at the same time. You knew that you were butterflies, but I always said that those butterflies were that I was excited to perform.
Perfect.
So it was a calm and excitement all at once.
Okay, so we've got calm and excitement. That's you at your best. So you're not pretending that the nerves weren't there, but you were interpreting them in a way that you felt them as excitement rather than felt them as
nerves, yeah.
Perfect. So we've actually covered a little bit of doing, a little bit of feeling. Sticking to these 2 now, whilst you're on that, what about you at your worst? Like, what was the opposite of those things?
I was always looking at the other athletes, the other competitors, always thinking, what are they doing? What are they warming up? What are they doing that I'm not doing? Why did they get down 2 tenths quicker than me? And comparing myself, but in a bad way.
Okay.
Because in our sport, we have to watch other competitors because that's how we learn how to slide. But this was then in a negative kind of way.
Okay, so on that, looking at others, I would have noticed that in you, so we'll put it on doing. Something else you mentioned there is, I think, what you were thinking, because you were looking at others, but you were also focusing on others. And it's important to make that differentiation. This is why we do this triangle, is to separate what we're doing and what we're thinking, because yes, the two kind of mesh together, but if we're going to create control, we need to be able to control one and or the other. So you're actually, in your negative, focusing on others. Okay. Out of interest, you at your best, what were you focused on?
Just me, my performance, knowing that I had prepared in the very best way that gave me the confidence just to have that kind of be at peace and be at calm, because I've done everything I can. This is it. I'm going to stand on the start line and I'm going to go and perform. There's nothing else to think about. So actually, in a weird way, your brain is empty because you've done it all. But then the very last minute, just before I'm about to sprint with my sled, I mean, you're going through these little cues, right? Drive my knees forward when I'm sprinting. Basic things that I need to do that's to do with my technique.
Yeah.
But then you're empty.
Brilliant. So that's important, because this might look different at different points in time. So as we are there with the potential distraction of other competitors, the media, we need to know what a good triangle looks like. When we're there on the start line, our focus might shift and it might need to be much more focused, much sharper. So this might look different, and that's fine, because we'd have the time to explore this for different areas. Finally, because it's the only one we haven't got, is how would you feel when things weren't, or when you're at your worst?
Well, just rubbish. Yeah, you would have that internal feeling of either you just want to go off and cry, or that kind of, why aren't I? You're questioning yourself. Why aren't I doing well? Why do I feel so gutted? Why do I feel frustrated? And I guess it could be that frustration building up of, I can't get that corner right on the track, or, why can't I just sprint that little bit more? So I guess it's probably a frustration and annoyance in yourself.
And how would that manifest in you? What would you notice, whether it's heart rates, or how does annoyance feel inside?
Oh, I've not really thought about it like that for a long time. I guess it's just an uncomfortableness. It's, I don't know whether I'd feel, my stomach go like that, or is that the only way that I can think about it? But this sort of uncomfortable annoyance, maybe a tighter chest, maybe a kind of shoulders coming up.
And you see,
sure.
You may not have the words for it, but already you're telling me you're doing this. And it's really interesting when people think about, obviously we don't want you to think about you at your worst too much, because the whole point here is that we're moving towards you at your best. But it's given me a great insight as to how you feel, even if you don't have the words for it, even if you can't articulate it. So of course, what's the opposite of that? It might sound obvious.
Well, yeah, you're just...
That, and there's a kind of openness which probably relates more to that. So, of course, these things all interact. There are kind of arrows that allow these things to interact with one another. But the genesis of control comes from being able to understand in very simple terms what good looks like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, totally. It's like you say, it can be very hard just to put it into words. And I guess people might find it quite hard to really think about it, of what words to use, because you've never allowed yourself maybe the space and the time to be able to sit and, as an exercise, physically put the words down on paper.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And you need that space, don't you, to do this. And interesting there, for example, you spoke about being frustrated, but you actually spoke about questioning yourself. Well, that's a mental thing. That's not an emotional thing, but we tie the two together. Of course, what that means is that you never sort of gain control of this. You never sort of notice the questioning style. You can shift a questioning style to a more directive style. Right, I'm going to do this. But you need to know you're doing it in order to do that.
Okay, Charlie, so everyone at home has gone and done this, done your exercise. Now what? What can they do with their words that they've written down?
Yeah, so there are a few things to do with this. What I'd really encourage you to do, by the way, is to do a separate triangle for you at your best, you at your worst. Keep them separate, just for space. I put them all in the same one here, but definitely have these as two separate things. What we want to be doing is closing the gap between you at your worst and you at your best. And the best way of doing that is by focusing on you at your best, that good triangle. So what I would encourage you to do is firstly just do this as an awareness raising exercise, because as you saw with Amy there, it's not as easy as you think articulating it and getting it down and trying to separate the various different entities. But if we're having a thought pattern that's affecting the way that we're breathing, which is then affecting what we're doing, then we get into this vicious cycle and we're not in control of it. So first things first, this is an awareness raising exercise. Get it down on paper, add to it, build on it. Think about you in different situations, you at your best, you at your worst. Then the final thing, I suppose, which I'm going to leave you with, is to identify one thing from each corner that reflects you at your best, that you can practice and do more deliberately. This is all about bringing to the conscious minds the little things that allow us to feel in control of the situation that we're in. So you're going to have that awareness, and then the final thing I'm going to get you to do is just to identify one thing from each corner that you can be more focused on or be more deliberate about doing to the best of your ability.
Okay, so for, I guess, me, if I was very aware that I was looking at other competitors, when I'm next, in a training practice, and I'm like, okay, I'm aware now, I am looking at the other girls, and I'm aware that what are they doing in their warm-up? It's like logging it in your own head, click, let's stop doing that.
Exactly, and I imagine for you, it is literally just that moment of awareness that says, I'm focusing on the wrong thing here. Interestingly, what's important is that you have an alternative focus to click back into. Yeah. And if we haven't done this, if we don't know what us at our best looks like, we don't have anything to click back into. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, fab. I have really enjoyed taking myself back 10 years. I hope you all have too. More importantly, what are we going to be doing now next week if everyone logs in and signs in? What are we going to be chatting about together?
Well, what we're going to do, we're actually going to focus in on an area of this one, which I think a lot of people really struggling is, which is managing my thoughts, especially when I'm under pressure. So we're going to be looking at this notion of performing in your bubble, which you've already suggested there. And ultimately, that's about being able to control the controllables.
Fab. Well, thank you, Charlie Unwin and myself, Amy Williams, with the You Perform channel. Thank you for joining us. Please subscribe if you haven't already and follow up on our last week's, and most importantly, please join us again next week. Press down on that bell button as well to set your reminders. Bye-bye for now.